even talked about religious education yet. That has different kinds of models across different kinds of countries around the world, and its place in schooling is often contested. Clearly, in some states, there's a clear separation of religions and schools. Classic examples would be the USA and France in different kinds of ways. Other countries have a kind of faith-based model, a German model where pupils and their parents choose between different kinds of approaches, Protestant, Catholic or Muslim, depending on your own particular religiosity, or a kind of a humanist ethics education. Other countries have opted to a kind of more impartial study of religions. The UK and Norway would be good examples of that. But actually, it's not even as simple as the fact that there are 3 different ways of doing it. Actually, what you get are mixes within these different countries. In the UK, we've mixed the pluralistic model with a tradition of faith schools. In France, which often proclaims itself as being very laic and having this strong separation, actually has a strong tradition of what are called écoles privées, which sound like private schools, but are actually state-funded schools in all sorts of ways, typically Catholic, but not necessarily. And actually in France, a lot of Muslim students will go to the Catholic schools because actually it's in those schools that you're allowed to wear religious symbols in all kinds of ways. Same in the States, where there's a strong tradition of Catholic schooling, outside state education, which is private, and also the Islamic schooling in the States is a similar kind of pattern. So these kinds of other kinds of approaches, religious approaches to schooling, are permitted, even if they're not state-run in the conventional sense. Nevertheless, what is true of all these different kinds of models is they usually see some kind of ethical outcomes for the subject, either within a kind of faith and nurture tradition, or because they seem as inculcating the kinds of democratic values that you would want in terms of tolerance or respect, open-mindedness for other kinds of thoughts and other kinds of beliefs. So those are the processes going on. But that curriculum is also then affected by the process of examinations. And there's a sort of double bind for religious education in schools here. You know, if you have the subject examined, then that raises the status in the schools. If you're unexamined, then that seems being devalued. You know, if you're a 13, 14, 15-year-old, you know, why would you have a subject that you're not going to be examined in if everything else is really very important and going to determine your future? What's your motivation really for studying that? And that creates a tension between the kind of testable curriculum, the kind of thing that you can be examined on, and the kind of subtleties of character formation that we've heard outlined earlier on. You know, if you go down the testable curriculum route, you get the kinds of credit and kudos that operate within a world in which assessment's important, but maybe you thereby miss out on the subtleties of character formation. On the other hand, if you go down character formation route and you're not examined, then maybe people won't take the subject particularly seriously. So those are the kinds of issues really, you know, confronting religious education in school settings. It's not that these kinds of ways of thinking are bad in any way, but they come up against and they rub against the other kinds of bigger pressures that are going on in schools in the 21st century. Just to report a little bit on some research I did some while ago, which was to look at ways in which what in this country we call Year 9 pupils, so 13 or 14-year-olds, could make sense of their own learning in qualitative study in many ways, just to look at how they made sense of what they were learning, whether they were able to articulate these kinds of processes and the links between their moral learning, making judgments about how their values had changed or progressed. So, first example, Dan said, it's quite hard, but I find expressing my views on other religions has kind of got better. Now that's just not really a kind of moral reflection, but that is him talking about how his ability to reflect on, to comment on for himself other religious views has improved in some kind of way. So here's a pupil who thinks he's made some kind of progress at that. The next example was exchange actually in the interview, the group interviews. Kevin went, I admit I could be a bit, Annie helpfully added, pig-headed. Kevin responded, yeah, but doing discussions made me think that it isn't. It's about other people's accounts as well. So I'm less intolerant. So interestingly, Kevin here has decided that he's become less intolerant than he used to be. He's recognised some kind of moral shift within himself. Interestingly, not as a result of actual formal curriculum, but as a result of using discussions as a pedagogical device. So for him, it was the process of having classroom discussions which led him to make this kind of change. So partly it's not just about what we teach, it's actually also about the pedagogy of how we teach, which is also important within this process. But then also what happened is pupils were able to kind of contest the terms. They started to kind of to try to decide whether they thought these were the most appropriate criteria or not. So Alan's comment here, I don't know. I wouldn't call it tolerance, because if you're saying tolerate them, it means you don't like them. This is a sort of classic philosophical issue to do with the word tolerate. I don't tolerate chocolate. I like chocolate. You know, tolerance is something which actually you can only tolerate things that you dislike. So there's an ambiguity around the use of the word. So I said respect then, and he went, yeah, respect. That's a better word. If you tolerate things, you put up with them. So what he's doing is kind of, he's deciding what the criteria actually are. He knows roughly the kind of area, but actually he's trying to make sure for himself to internalise what the criteria are going to be. And what was interesting with this particular research is, it wasn't me saying, have these people become less tolerant or more respectful? It was about their own understanding and contestation of the terms. So just a short example of some pupils, and really in a sense what they're capable of at that kind of age. So, to sum up, I think really there are kind of opportunities here. We've clearly highlighted the long religious traditions of reflection, different elements to that, different ways of conceiving those inner processes. Clearly there's new interest in self-regulation within school education. There are kind of opportunities there for aligning these kinds of processes alongside each other. Excuse me. And also there are opportunities clearly in terms of lifelong learning and the kinds of opportunities that provides. But there are clearly some challenges as well. There are new pressures simply to learn by rote. The kinds of testing that we introduce often tend towards actually a kind of reduction in terms of curriculum rather than an enrichment of it. What I haven't talked about is the kind of global inequalities in educational systems and opportunities. The graph from the start was based on some research in the US, and clearly if we carried out that kind of research in jobs in other parts of the world, we might get very different kinds of positions and views as to how employment is changing. The challenge is also the kind of narrowness of the targets in terms of what we expect. And it is ultimately the question, this mismatch with the reflected inner life. Is this kind of quite instrumental approach, if you like, to self-reflection actually the same as the kinds of reflection that we've heard spoken about earlier on. So thank you very much.
I would really like to thank all of the speakers for taking us through a journey of self-reflection. It's been very illuminating. So if you guys don't mind, can we take 15 minutes off the break so we have half an hour for questions? If anyone has to leave, they're free to do so. So now we're going to take, the template will be, we'll take 3 questions and then you address who you want to answer the question. And then after the session is over, people who signed up for the workshops can meet me and Amina next to the cafeteria on this floor. So we'll try. Is there a mic, or we'll just have to speak loudly, I guess. So yeah, we'll take 3 questions in a row.
So my question is for Professor Ramadan. One of the things you said particularly stuck with me, and you said there is no faithfulness without evolution. And I wonder if you could just speak on that a bit more.
Thank you very much for the really enlightening presentation. My question is also to Dr. Tariq Ramadan. You, Professor, mentioned that self-reflection is not a natural habit or not a natural thing. And I would like to know more about this because to touch the basic definition of this, I have exactly the opposite idea of it, which is very natural because this is what differentiates the human from animal. So we start to become human just when we start to reflect upon ourselves, and here the process of education starts. And this is what the poem of Dr. Talal Al-Azem at the very beginning referred to when they mention the difference between the human and that the human starts to become a human when he focused on himself. And this is why he translated, I guess, as the mind of the intellect.
Thank you very much for all the speakers. I want to address Professor Ramadan as well. In one of his books, Joseph Campbell said that religion is a mythology interpreted literally as opposed to figuratively. How do you respond to that statement?
So the first question was about there is no faithfulness without evolution. And the second is self-reflection, a natural thing. And then the third was about the comment about Joseph Campbell, saying that religion is a form of mythology.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I was saying about, the picture that the way I was dealing with the issue was through a big picture. It was not, and I think it's complementing what we heard in a practical way, in a philosophical, psychological, and spiritual way. What I was saying about the way we read the scriptural sources and the way we deal with even what we heard from pre-modern and modern and what we are facing today, that our faithfulness to the meaning of the texts is through intellectually evolving and spiritually deepening our understanding of things. So what I'm saying, for example, on legal issues, our faithfulness to the text is to evolve, is to try to. So there is a saying in the prophetic tradition saying, إن الله يبعث لهذه الأمة على رأس كل 100 سنة من يجدد لها دينها. Every century you have somebody or a group of people who are helping this community to renew, يجدد لها دينها. التجديد or the renewal or the reform, it's based and has to do with evolving. So our faithfulness to this. But at the individual level, it's exactly the same. The faithfulness to, for example, تزكية النفس, or for example, the very meaning of al-muraqaba or al-mujahid. It's all about evolving with your own self. You are not always the same. So to take into account, so the faithfulness to the project, the faithfulness to the objective, is through intellectual and spiritual evolution. So it's multidimensional. Maybe I did not express myself the right way, or it was too quick. What I didn't think that self-reflection is not natural. I really think to be a human, you have to go through the process. What I was saying it's you are able to, but it's not natural to. In fact, you can go with your own consciousness, you can go with your conscience. So this is why everything which has to do with the spiritual dimension, everything which has to do with tazkiyat an-nafs, has to do with what? You can remember, you can go through dhikr. Dhikr is human, but there is something which could be natural with you, which is nisyan, forgetfulness. So in fact, you have the capacity to remember but you have the nature to forget. That's what I meant. By saying, to come to the potential, there is a jihad. There is jihad in nafs. There is mujahada. So you have to resist, in fact. And this is why even in one of the verses coming at the end of the Quran, when you say, by the time the people are going towards their own, there is something which is a process, which is a regression and corruption. إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, those who resist. So this is why it's natural, because you can do it, and you are called to do it. You are requested, expected to do it. But the natural way could be to forget. Is to forget, in fact, that we are beings that are able, of course, to forget and to forget everything, and you have to struggle to remember. A dhikr, remembrance, is a jihad against your own potential nature. So this is what I meant. And I think that this is critical, because at the same time what I'm saying is that we don't have something in the Islamic tradition which is the original sin. We don't have this. But we are in between. In fact, this is why what was said with the pre-modern is the moral dimension is based on your choice. We have no moral qualification of what is. We have moral qualification of what is chosen. So it's about your choice. So the body is not bad in itself, or it's not good. Even in nafs, there are long discussions on this, but I don't have time now. You're asking me about what I think of what you were saying about mythology.
Yeah, because it's somehow related to this self-critical thing, because we are supposed to be critical of outside compared to what we did compared to what the rules say. But then how do we criticize, or should we criticize the rules itself? And that rules are embedded in like when we refer to Greek mythology, we can sum up the main thread without actually doing what the gods or what the heroes did. But in this, in the case of religion, there are a lot of rituals that we have to follow in order to fully live the religion. And probably that was Joseph Campbell was referring to by saying that the religion is a mythology that is interpreted too literally. What do you?
Okay, so I think that this is a question for all of us.
Yeah.
Not only for me. I will start, and then I think that we all have to respond to that. Look, that's there is a discussion that I had once with Dawkins, which was exactly the same. He was telling me, you are not exercising your true critical thinking if you are not even questioning the very essence of religion, because this is a myth. This is just something which was invented by people. And he looked at me and said, how you can still believe in the mythology and lies? And this is so the way he was looking at the critical mind and the critical thinking is in a scientific way. You have to question everything. And he was thinking that anything else is quite irrational. And my answer to this is that no, rationality has limits. So it's a very rational thing, by the way, to say that, rationally I think that there are limits to what we want to question. And at one point, I would come back to something which is, even in Munqidh min al-Dalal, in Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, but even you find this in the Kantian approach, when he was saying, at one point I know, and at one point I believe. So I would say, no, I really, as a believer, there is one point where your rationality surrenders to something which is, this is not mythology, this is the truth, but this is what I believe is the truth. Now, I can understand pushing in a rationalistic or, irrationalist views. My point on this is when rationality doesn't acknowledge limits. And this is what I was saying when he was saying, in the name of the how, there would be no why left. At the end, we will go up to this. Science will be able to reach this. And it is now, by all what we have about the invisible, about bioethics, all this genomics and all these things that we have. And I would say for me, from my perspective, I'm very ready for critical thinking with something which is intellectual humility. To the point for me that questioning the answers of the people as to why we are here and the relationship to God is for me something which could be a perception of arrogance, intellectual arrogance, which, by the way, is one of the first sins in Islam, in our tradition, is human arrogance. So don't talk about myth. I can understand from where he can speak about this, but I don't think that we are following the same routes and answering in the same way. And what I'm saying, just it's not less rationalistic or scientific than what he is saying.
Dr. Talal, would you like to respond to the question as well?
The only thing perhaps to add, again, drawing from the same sources that I talked about in the presentation, is that there's a discussion, this comes actually in a number of works, including in the aforementioned Ihya al-Din that Professor Ramadan talked about, the distinction between the ulum al-akhirah and the ulum al-dunya. I'm talking about classifications of knowledge. And what Ghazali says about this is interesting. He says a lot of people in our own age assume that certain disciplines are religious disciplines, when in fact they are worldly disciplines. And he talks about this in reference to, for example, Islamic law. He gives the example of marriage laws and divorce. He said there's nothing inherently religious about these. These are here to help regulate people's affairs, etc. What the true religious disciplines are those that help you see things in relation to eternity, the bigger picture. So I think this is perhaps an interesting point of departure for thinking about questions as to what do we mean by mythology. And again, the term itself sometimes is used in a very simplistic fashion when in the field of religious studies. It's a long-standing debate, as I'm sure you're aware. And what does it mean in relation to various religious traditions' own self-visions as to the role of religion or what religion does? And you find this spoken, again, in pre-modern context especially, works by philosophers, by theologians, by mystics, with actually a wide range of views. I have in mind, for example, I think a 4th century philosopher and theologian, Al-Amiri, who talks, his work is on a defense of Islam's work, but really comes off as a defense of religion within a culture that was engaging in his time with the Greek tradition. And in so doing it, trying to define what is religion, where does it stand in relation to the stories that are told. Some of these very same questions. And the answers are not always very pietistic in the sense of, everything is religious and everything else can be ignored. That's all perhaps, as possible lines of inquiry to look into.
Dr. Nigel,
Yeah, it's a kind of an interesting comment. I was thinking about it in terms of kind of the criteria. I mean, all education involves getting young people to learn something, and we spend a long time, practically 2 decades of young people's lives making them do this, because we think there is some external stuff outside them which exists within society, which it's very important for us to get into their minds. We see that as being really kind of a good thing to do. So most education is essentially a struggle to get this kind of external criteria, this kind of curriculum into the minds of the learners, and then to get them to internalize it. I wasn't born knowing algebra, that's for sure. Somebody taught that to me. But in a sense, the religious position is actually that the criteria are already internal. That actually we know these things, or at least we should know them, they're in our mind somewhere, and what we've got to do is kind of look within ourselves to find them. So, the use of the word mythologies is in a sense kind of almost a sort of reverse of that, to kind of make, oh look, it's just one of those other things that you're getting them to learn. It's the same as Greek myths. It's the same as all those things. So it's not just a view that it's untrue. It's also a view that it has a different kind of status, if you like. It is, rather than being something which is very definitely internal.
I'd like to sort of abuse my power here and ask the panelists a question about authority in their respective lectures. Dr. Talal, how was authority of the teacher sort of linked to the notion of self-reflection and muhasaba in the education? And for Professor Ramadan, you talked about sort of interrogating our turath and our religious heritage and differentiating between the divine and the sort of more man-made ijtihad. So does this turath have an authority that extends beyond the actual teachings? Does our turath have an authority? And for Dr. Nigel, I wanted to ask about how students receive specific authority and how authority is exercised upon them. Oh yeah.
Oh yes, this is for Professor Nigel. I know you touched on distance learning and working from home, for example, but I'm wondering if you can speak to the aspect of virtuality in education and preparing, new generations for ever increasing and perhaps disturbing levels of virtuality in the future.
I have just a question to the Talali, Professor Tariq Ramadan and Talal. Just don't you think that the reform or in the process of self-regulation has not to do whether we should answer to put the fiqh in the front or the question natural, but also to think outside the box that we're living right now, which is modernity, and to question modernity. And the real reform is also to question the questions that we're asking, because even the questions that we're asking are coming from a certain context, with its nation state, with its secularism, with its racism, with its colonization. And if I can give just one example, I know that the Muslims right now are living in a period where they should deal with this context, and they should answer to many questions that are linked to this context. But there is a difference between giving an individual fatwa to a Muslim who is asking, for example, to get a loan, for example, from a bank, or giving a structural fatwa, as Muhammad Abdu did when he was at the head of the Azhar, under the power of the colonizer, under the British system, and trying to answer to a question that were never been asked before. So I'm just asking about self-regulation in this, and regulation or reflection in this way, and especially for the Muslim thinkers, because every single Muslim cannot think in that way. But I'm just asking you, as Muslim thinkers, Muslim reformists, how do you look at the reform from this way? Because I think that Dr. Tariq Ramadan, I feel that you're taking us towards modernity, while I think personally, and I'm asking you the question, don't you think that the real reform will be to think outside modernity?
We'll start with the question to Dr. Nigel about distance learning and virtuality.
Yeah, interesting question in a number of ways. The issues around kind of technology in general is on the one hand, there's a sort of view that young people are all digital natives and that they're kind of strict ahead of their teachers, and that sort of is both true and not true. There's also an emergent class of young people who don't have access to the digital world in all sorts of ways, both within this country, more developing areas of the world, and kind of other areas of the world. So there's a question about who has access to this technology anyway. In terms of the kind of pedagogical implications of it, it works in a number of ways. And one is, it's a vehicle simply for learning the kinds of things we used to learn in the old days. I mean, it's the equivalent of your exercise book, but it's online. The alternative is that actually it becomes a new kind of learning in itself. So there's different kinds of things going on around that. There was someone I was at another conference with recently had this great photograph of this classroom of kids who were all learning online. But when you looked at the photograph, their laptops were down. And they said, well, why is that? So, well, and the teacher said, well, when their laptops are all up, they don't focus on me. So, the model of learning was still the same. The teacher was at the front and the children were waiting for instruction rather than actually being genuinely engaged in it. But you're right in the sense that these kinds of opportunities put another demand on the kind of self-regulating learner, because we can all sign up to all sorts of MOOCs or whatever, all sorts of things we can sign up to straight away, different ways of finding out about the world automatically. So it's really what an individual I want to do with that, but B, as a society, how do we provide the learning opportunities for young people to do that?
So can we answer Amin's question about sort of questioning modernity and responding to the questions of the modernity being within that frame of modernity?
Well, again, just keeping in line with the kind of more historical presentation, when I go through the texts that I tend to do, you don't find a hesitation to engage with ideas that have arisen from various cultures, different times, etc. In fact, this is probably one of the hallmarks, especially of the high medieval period, the early medieval period before the turn of the 13th, 14th centuries, the Common Era. But even as contemporary research is starting to show, actually well beyond that. I think it's a question that if one wanted to keep consistent with various pre-modern traditions, it's a matter of approaching things principially, without losing sight as to the core definitions of what we talked about, what it means to be human, how various practices impact upon one's humanity, one's views onto things. For example, in our own age, how certain technologies in education, like these MOOCs and other things, may quietly or overtly manipulate and change certain relationships, such as the relationship of student to teacher, as we heard in that anecdote, where that relationship on a very personal, even physical, mimetic level, is something that was very important throughout the various modern Muslim traditions, and indeed beyond the Muslim world. That's on a kind of historical. If we speak about modernity as a philosophical contract, which is to say certain revolts against what was pre-modern, then this is, of course, a different thing. But in the same way, the answer is going to be the same, which is, if we take, for example, certain Kantian notions as points of departure as to the moral self, keeping with what we've been talking about today, then this is something that simply would have to be engaged, or has been engaged with. Indeed, there are various figures, Muslim and non-Muslim traditions, religious and irreligious, that have, or non-religious, I should say, that have engaged with these ideas. And to do so consistently, and this is where I think then, if one wants to do it within the Muslim tradition, to really understand, and in this sense truly critically engage with the notions and the definitions and the practice. It's not just intellectual but also embodied, that perhaps philosophically speaking modernity or modern constructs have tried to do away with. And that's not a task for any one individual. I mean, this is very broad, of course, but they're just touchstones, perhaps more concrete advice there.
Yes, first, I think that what Talal said, it's very important. It's not new that we have the questions of our time started. And in a way, I think that in previous times, Muslim scholars were even sometimes much more open come to a critical discussion and to take and to select in what, and they were going very far, the discussions between the scholars about what can we take from the Greek philosophy, from, this was a very deep discussion about, the answers of Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Jawziyah, to the people who are going too far by accepting the Greek logic, for example. These are questions that are very old questions, and they were dealing and tackling issues. In our time today, I don't know what are you referring to when you are saying that I'm leading people towards modernity. I think that's not at all what I'm doing. Even in many texts that I have been writing about is questioning modernity. What is modernity about? And what I said right now, it's a double critical approach. Being critical towards our legacy by saying, these are things that are coming from the text, and in which we, even with great scholars, there are many things that I'm taking, for example, from Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, and many things that I'm rejecting because he is a thinker of his time. Exactly the same with all the scholars that we have, even to understand that they evolved, and he himself was saying things about, for example, the relationship between men and women, the relationship with, there are things that are to be questioned in our tradition, so to be self-critical with this. But at the same time, when we have challenges in our times, to face them. And when you face them, it doesn't mean that you're accepting the way it is. And I kept on repeating for years, you have to question the questions that are put to you. Always. But also the whole system, what we have now is, for example, from within the West, is to question our educational institutions that very often are producing and educating people to fit to a very specific ideology. And we have to discuss this. We have to evaluate educational institutions. What do you want to produce, in fact? Which type of human beings do you want? And this is why in the discussion that we just had, a very interesting point, there is something which for me, it's critical crossing the board. You find it in the Islamic tradition, you find it in the West, you find it everywhere, is the fragmentation of knowledge. And the fragmentation of knowledge, based also on something which is missing, is the assessment of the objectives. What are the goals? And if there is something that I want to challenge, so to be involved in modern discussion is not that you are surrendering into the dominant ideology. But the only way to challenge the ideology is to deal with it, is to deal with from within, and to question the question within, and from even, I'm going deep in this, in a cosmological, and what I find in the Torah is sometimes, some of the paradigmatic assumptions that we have to come back, I find them with scholars in the past. They say, this is what I need. I need what they were saying here. And they were going through discussions that were very important for us now. Not to repeat what they said, but to get the methodology through which and on which they were relying on this. So when it comes to, when you were saying about Muhammad Abdu, for example, it's not exactly right. Muhammad Abdu, when he was the Mufti of Egypt, this is after the colonization, and what he said was after the colonization about, for example, interest and things like this, to the point that some are understanding that what he was saying about interest, by saying it's not really interest, riba is not really riba, was to surrender to the dominant reality of his time. So it's not exactly the same, which I don't really agree with. Both what he said about him and the way he was constructing the argument. But because at the end, for me, it's the problem that we have, and this is why I think that our tradition is deeper in the past than it is today, because what was questioned in the past very often is what are the principles and what are the objectives, and how do we deal with the means. In the light of the two, in many of our, and with thinkers that we have, today very often we think that we are questioning modernity by Islamizing the means, and not being critical as to the objective. So if we Islamize the means, that's a very problem. I think this is where we are surrendering to modernity without acknowledging it. By just having a legal framework, say this is halal, this is haram, this is where we are, but where? Where? In which way? And how are you dealing with, I don't know, global culture, global economy? So just to tell me that we have halal movies, as something which is resisting modernity, I think that's exactly the opposite. Or halal compliant economic or financial procedures, I think that is exactly the opposite. So the people who are sometimes, I'm not talking about you, some people who are telling me that sometimes I'm going towards modernization and surrounding to modernity, are much more accepting modernity in the way they deal with it than I am. I'm very critical on both sides.
Yeah, so the last question about authority, if we could just go this way. So from Dr. Talal, Dr. Tariq.
There's probably been no, in Islamic studies, especially of education, there's probably been no bigger question than this one. So I could give you perhaps a longer biography to keep you busy for the next few years if that's what's being looked for on the question. But to try to summarize, or at least a few points, not really summary, just a few things that come to mind. It's number one, with all these types of things, it is always very culture specific, time specific. But if we take Marshall Hudson's view of kind of a trans-regional Islamic culture that developed by the 11th, 12th century, then one thing that we do find is number one, the importance, centrality of the teacher. And so in that sense, the authority, both for transmitted purposes, but also then for the cultivating, as we saw, of certain attitudes and comportment and what was generally deemed adab. From there, it's also then discipline specific. So some disciplines, you find that from the very get-go, the role of the teacher is to serve as an instigator. So you see, for example, the development in the 13th, 14th centuries of adab, Bahth al-Munadhara. The teacher is not trying to teach a doctrine, they're trying to teach a method. And this method then can be